It's just so important that these take the form of a series of points that are made and understood in a kind of communal way, so that it enters into the discussion. And so if you don't show up, it doesn't enter into the discussion. It's hard. You know what I realized today? There's just one thing, and then I'm going to turn it over. I just had a thought. All right. My first point. No, this is I'm gonna give, this is for Todd and Marcelin in particular. I'm saying, no, I'm giving you something that's gonna just make their life a little more difficult. No, we were going through projects today. They're, talking, mentioning some very famous architect to someone who shall remain nameless, who didn't know who this guy was. And one thing you do realize with graduate thesis in particular, and with thesis more than with other studios, like the more stuff that you know, the better the thesis is. Like, it's not a talent thing, like the moves, like you have to know a lot of projects and some related things in other fields, things that are generally happening with culture. And if all of that stuff, you want to spend your time here. I want to say this to like the first year students, especially for the 3-year. If you spend your time here just building up extra, store up all of your batteries with all of this knowledge, it makes things much easier to think about what to do when you have this constellation of projects and ideas that you can work on. If you don't have that, you got to sit there and you got to go ask Todd and Marcelin for a bunch of projects that that you don't know, and they'll fill in the blanks for you. You give it to them. No, and it's true, but the difference between us, and it's better than nothing, but the difference between us giving it to you in thesis prep and you kind of coming in knowing it, it just makes a difference. But certainly during thesis prep, you want to take care of it. So these talks, I think, touch on that, and we do see them this way. Todd obviously doesn't need any introduction. You know who he is, and there was one student who didn't know a particularly well-known essay, and I said, well, I am sure the attempts have been made to hammer this into you over the last 2 or 3 years, even if it wasn't actually absorbed. So here with another hammering of useful knowledge is Todd Gannon. Thank you. Yeah, useful hammering.
There's also the past tense of hammer, which is interesting in other contexts. So, yeah, some of you are here. I don't know, I've talked to a lot of you guys already this semester. I'll talk to many of you. Certainly will speak a lot between now and September. I think Andrew's right. I mean, it's good to think of this as a kind of rolling conversation, and voices kind of come in and come out. There's a certain amount of repetitiveness involved. There's a certain amount of insertion of new material. As those of you who've already spoken to me about your thesis projects kind of know, I've been trying to concentrate more and more, and this isn't just this year's project, but for the past couple of years, I've been trying to spend more and more time talking about and working with all of you on the kind of discursive component of thesis. Now, just to be clear, I do think 90 to 95% of your time is probably spent on the kind of labor, right? Figuring out how to make the thing, actually making the thing, making iterations, et cetera. But I think without that 5 to 10% of stepping back periodically and making sure what you're doing has the kind of focus that it had going in with, or periodically assessing the transformations that have happened over the course of the development of the project. I think it's really important to be doing that. I also think it's really important for us to be hyper attentive to the language that we use to present projects. Like, I firmly believe that a project can't stand on its own. Like, it can't. I'm pretty sure there's no such thing as architecture until there's a kind of discursive component. I'm sure there are people that agree with me. I'm sure there are perfectly reasonable alternative views. But near as I can tell, it's those projects that enter into the conversation, that get people talking, that get people looking at other projects differently, that are really the important ones to the field, to the discipline, let's say. So I want to concentrate today really on some of those discursive things. I mean, partly this is just some tips as to how to be efficient as you move through the thesis, and partly it's looking at some of these linguistic or rhetorical transformations that I've been interested in. So there's 5 points, and we'll go through them. I'll go through them kind of quickly. Some of this you've maybe seen in the past. I've tried to insert, I want to kind of go through some of this material that I've been looking at, but kind of shift the emphases a little bit. So if it seems a little bit familiar, don't worry, it will change as we go. Now, this is a quote that I've been kind of inserting into talks and syllabi and things for the past couple of years, and I was very flattered when Jeff called me the other day and asked to borrow it for his talk with Eric. But I really think that I think this is what we're about here. I mean, that interesting architecture really is a contest between an entrenched vocabulary, which has become a nuisance, and a half-formed new one, which vaguely promises great things. So, I mean, I think this kind of encapsulates thesis. And so just to start off, I just want to say, I want to encourage all of you to vaguely promise great things. You don't have to have the definitive answer, just like kind of, be a little flirtatious about it. And I want to encourage you with equal emphasis to avoid being a nuisance as much as possible. So hopefully these 5 points that I want to go through today will help do that. And so here we go. The first one has to do with similarity and difference. You all know this quote, that there's nothing new under the sun. It comes from the Bible. It's real old. And we often hear this around architecture schools for various reasons. I mean, it's a kind of inoculation against naivete or thinking that everything you've done has just happened. It helps to kind of combat a sort of superficial valorization of the new for the sake of its novelty. And it tends to be pretty easy to demonstrate, right? So if we look at something like this, Frank Gehry's project in Cleveland, we could pretty easily say, well, I've seen that before. We've seen it in Bilbao. We've seen it down the street. Peter Eisenman showed us that we saw it in Berlin, that it's really a kind of variation on the theme of Schinkel. And so we could use a fairly standard disciplinary apparatus and lock Gehry's building into a very kind of seamless progression of historical architecture and make it look like it's pretty much just repeating the same old, same old. So right through from Gehry to Stirling to Corbusier, now to Schinkel, to Lord Burlington, to Palladio. Take a few more steps, we could get it all the way back to the primitive hut, right? So this is a very common tactic in history in particular. You find something weird and you say it's not that weird, it's just one of these. And so this tactic has a kind of domesticating function. It helps to kind of mitigate difference, but so you can see that it's easy to say there's nothing new under the sun. Now, if we simply describe that transformation differently, we can come to a very different conclusion. So let's say we start at the primitive hut. As we move to the Parthenon, whether we see this as the conversion of myth to reality, whether we see this as the conversion of wood to stone, there's a lot of new stuff going on here. Big step, I understand, but moving from the Parthenon to Palladio, we see suddenly, this is a very weird use of temple architecture, almost, but not quite, the first time that a temple porch was ever put on a house. It was never done before. This is a complete misreading of history. So we also see a whole bunch of rooms inside, which typically don't see in classical temples. When we go to Burlington, suddenly it becomes much more frontal. The rooms are specific, the red room, the green room, the gallery, etc. By the time we get to Schinkel, we see tectonic transformations taking place. Notice the steel frame around the edge. Notice also, does that? That didn't work. Is this a laser? Those are voids open to the sky. So suddenly it seems the pieces are almost expanding. So that diagram of drum in the center, a kind of U-shaped porch, or a U-shaped wrapper, and then a colonnaded porch, is exactly, it's still exactly there here. It's still there here. When we move to Le Corbusier, we see that the field of columns has now spread over that entire space. The pochet has kind of vanished. The drum is sort of slipped out of the center. The porch seems to be even more loosely affiliated than before. With Sterling, the porch is turned back into trees. The dome has gone away for some reason. The U-shaped wrapper remains. By the time we get to Gary, we see again that split, which we first saw in Sterling. You don't see it so well there, but trust me, you all know. There's that split and the shift in Gary. We see that the kind of central rotunda has either compressed into a desk or is starting to kind of, by a sort of formal mitosis, split into two centers. The porch kind of reformulates as these pieces here. So we can see that exact same progression, not as same, but the kind of serial production of difference and novelty. So, as I said, we tend, when we're like writing term papers and stuff, to work in terms of those domesticating similarities. I think in the thesis, the right way to move is to work in terms of differences. So, point number one, quite simply, privilege difference over similarity. Now, another, just really quickly, I want to tell you that the second part has to do with cliches. So there's nothing new under the sun is not just, it can be correct or incorrect depending on how we deploy it. It's also a cliché. It's, you know, and cliché, of course, is a funny word. It comes from French typesetting. When typesetters used to, when they would assemble, you know, pages letter by letter, it helped them go faster by ganging up commonly used letters. So they would put all the little metal letters together and then weld them and have a single piece. Another word for this is a stereotype. And cliché is thought to be the noise that it made when you dipped that metal into the water. Cliché. So it has since come to mean the kind of overuse of typical, you know, the overuse of kind of tired conventions. Once upon a time is a cliché, thinking outside the box, etc. Now, all cliches, we could say, operate by a very simple set of terms. They all work through repetition. The way something becomes a cliche is by doing it again and again and again and again and again. They tend to eradicate authorship. If you think about the phrase once upon a time, for instance, if you go back and look at the literary record, nobody can figure out who first wrote it. It's like everywhere. Nobody knows who started it. My favorite theory is the one that credits it to Claude Perrault, the brother, or no, I'm sorry, to Charles Perrault. Claude Perrault, famous from the Querelle, his brother, who used it in all of his fairy tales. So it has a kind of funny architectural link. But you can see that cliches tend to erase the author of that phraseology from history. And they also follow a fairly easy formula. And that formula is this: innovation, repetition, codification, parody, and finally cliche. So here's how it works. We can start with the innovation. In this case, we'll take Le Corbusier's Maison Domino. Now, this isn't the first concrete frame structure. This isn't the first attempt to produce prefabricating housing, but it is a kind of important consolidation of a lot of ideas that were in the air about 100 years ago. We know that Le Corbusier very quickly deployed it repetitively, producing the white villas. We know that he very quickly codified it in the 5 points of architecture. So we see this process moving. This catches on. Everybody kind of gets the cookbook, starts making their own, and very quickly we have not just simple repetitions, just doing it again and again, but parodies. So if we look at, say, the crappy apartments in Westwood, which is a kind of lowbrow parody of the 5 points, or the Getty Center, which is really a highbrow parody. So parody becomes a way to kind of swerve the repetitions into a different space that was maybe not intended. So I don't mean by parody making fun of something necessarily, although that's one way to do it, but rather kind of twisting the principles toward new ends. And I think if that doesn't happen, another way to think of that would maybe be Deleuze's use of the simulacrum, I would say, is very similar to my use of parody. And if that doesn't happen, what you get is the hardening of those ideas into cliches, which we see in something like Dwell. Now, to make sure that we get this formula, to prove that this formula works all over the place, we can look at another instance of cliché formation. In this case, we go back to the YouTube phenomenon Gangnam Style, which we'll take as the innovation. We know that when it first came out, it went from 90 million to 1 billion hits in like a month and a half, so there's your repetition. You may not know, it was very quickly codified as the 5 points of Gangnam Style. Here's how you do it. I love that there's 5 of them. And very quickly, and here's where I think it starts to get interesting, you get parodies. So you get the lowbrow parody, Gannon Style, they almost spelled it right. You get Ai Weiwei doing a kind of highbrow parody. And then it has devolved into the kind of contemporary version of the chicken dance or the electric slide. So my point is, you have to watch out as you're kind of working on various ideas, because it's a slippery slope from the Maison Domino to the electric slide. So let's look at this again. These 4, I think basically every project in Thesis can be categorized in one of these 5 slots. Typically, the thesis projects that we get the most are repetitions and parodies. I think these are both really good places to work in Thesis, that you either take a project that is in the process of being worked out and contribute to its development, or you take a project that has been kind of around for a little while and you figure out a way to sort of spin it in a new direction. Every once in a while, we get legitimate innovations. We get a lot more that think they're legitimate innovations when they're in fact that, or maybe that. We don't get too many of these. I think this is more the job of us. What I'm doing right now is a kind of codification of Thesis as a process. And we unfortunately get a bunch of those, which I want to get rid of. So I think I want you all to kind of think hard about where your work maybe falls in this process and take that seriously. Now, we know that there are all kinds of stories about cliché breaking. I mean, this is a very cliché topic almost lately. And we know that Gilles Deleuze was maybe, has articulated the most sustained attack on cliché in recent critical theoretical conversations. And remember that for Deleuze, the clichés that he was fighting was not just the cliché of representation, which he called figuration. Think of that when you're using that, when you throw that term around. He also saw abstraction as having fallen into a certain kind of cliched usage. And so to battle the clichés on both of these, Deleuze proposes the figure, which he found most significantly in the writings of Francis Bacon, that the figure was a way to kind of smash the clichés. We've seen this story, we've read Deleuze, we've heard different versions about it. I think what's important, and what maybe has sort of slid by over these last few years, is that there's a tendency to not notice when we form our own clichés, when our work starts to harden into a kind of exhausted prototype as opposed to continuing to develop. If you guys watched Jeff's talk about with Dwayne and Jenny a couple of weeks ago or last week, he talked about clichés as well, and he said an interesting thing. He said that clichés aren't necessarily bad, they just don't have any power anymore. And so we kind of have to shelve them and wait, and you return to them after they can be kind of have their efficacy renewed. And I think that that's true, and I think also we have a tendency that there are a lot of mechanisms to help produce them. Here's Sucker Punch this morning. So just randomly looking at Sucker Punch. Sucker Punch, I think, is the cliché proliferation engine of contemporary architecture. You can see here, this is a codification project. I don't know what this is, who wrote it, I don't know anything about it, but morphing. So already there's a kind of instruction manual. Here's how you do it. I know there's a SCI-Arc project down here. I don't know whose it is. I don't know much about it. I hope it's a good parody as opposed to a cliched repetition. So point number 2, quite simply, avoid clichés. Now, part 3, this has to do really with another kind of attitude that I think is important to have. It's very easy to get really worried when you're making a thesis about what you're doing. I think it's equally important to pay attention to how you're doing it, right? And so again, if we go back to Le Corbusier, I mean, he lays out the 5 points as a kind of a recipe, but very limiting, right? I mean, so the 5 points gives you a tectonic strategy, a compositional strategy for interior program, a representational strategy for the walls, gives you the idea about the roof and lifting it off the ground. And notice, though, that it's not quite neutral. So you go through the 5 points. There's 2 points for facades. There's no points for doors. And the point about ribbon windows basically cancels the point about free facade. Right? Free facade, do whatever you want. Point number 3. Point number 4, ribbon windows. So you have to watch these codifications because they tend to kind of steer you in funny ways. Now, less known is the fact that Le Corbusier also had not just the 5 points, but also the 4 compositions, right? So the relatively easy one associated with the picturesque assemblage of the Villa La Roche, the Très Difficile Garches, the Très Facile, the really easy Carthage project, and then the very generous, his favorite one, the kind of basically the combination of this and this, or this and that, into a single block in the Villa Savoie. So Le Corbusier was very conscious of knowing exactly which kind of project he was working on at which time. So he wasn't just operating by the 5 points, but he was always operating within an understanding of the 4 compositions. And his followers, similarly, were doing that as well. So here we can see Richard Meyer very famously kind of repeating a kind of Deleuzian good copy, you might say, the manner of Le Corbusier in the Smith's house. Significant diversions. I think you could make the case that this is as much a swerve as a straight repetition. But if we look at something like the Ipswich project by Norman Foster, we see a much more canny reworking of the 5 points. Now, we know that when things kind of get old, our tendency is to say, okay, I'm against that. I'm not going to do the 5 points anymore. I'm going to do something else. And that's the kind of language of critical culture. We're very familiar with that kind of antagonistic attitude when it comes to developing projects. Foster in this project, which I like for a lot of reasons, in this case, did something incredibly clever. He followed all 5 of the 5 points. You can see the roof garden there. It has pilotis. Here's the ribboniest ribbon window you've ever seen. So he did everything that the 5 points prescribe and produced something that the 5 points never would have predicted, this incredibly strange visual effects on the facade, an almost picturesque attitude about occupying that site. And that picturesqueness of this project really has a lot to do if you study something like Townscape, which is this sort of antithesis to the 5 points, also a cookbook, in this case 40 points laid out to tell you how to make a good neo-modern picturesque project. Foster followed all 40 of those points as well. So rather than saying no, 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 this is a really great example of that kind of yes and attitude. It's like, I can do that, and I can do that, and I can do that. So I think it becomes a really interesting project. Notice even it has a kind of ha-ha on the edge. As you come up from the inside onto this roof, the building kind of disappears. It's like there's no building at all. He did some interesting diagrams that you can't see, some a little bit more interesting diagrams. You can see he was really also kind of rethinking how you describe the project. So stairs bad, dumbwaiters good, crowded lunchrooms bad, big nice ones good. So he was conscious of the representational techniques. So I think point number 3, privilege how over what. Now, I want to spend a little bit more time on point number 4. I think this is really where I think this is mostly my job in thesis, is to concentrate on this part. You're in perfectly good hands in terms of the projects that you're doing. I've been working very hard to not change them in any way. But I do want to change quite a bit the way that you talk about your projects. And having been doing this for a long time now, I can say with utter consistency, at this stage, thesis projects tend to be described in really similar ways. They're generally too general. The thesis is usually articulated at first as a kind of umbrella over an entire genre of practice. So you can think of my thesis is about light, or my thesis is about nature. It's problematic. They also tend to be too abstract. A good sign that your thesis is too abstract is if the main words in your presentation of it end in ity, ism, ation, ing, any of those endings that take a verb and turn it into a noun. because those endings tend to speak the language of similarity. They tend to speak the language of category. They speak the language of familiarity. And so what happens is that you try to come up with a concept, you try to make it big because that's what you think a thesis is supposed to sound like, and it becomes familiar in that process. And so I want to combat that attitude. And a way to combat it, I think Colin Rowe offered a really great alternative to that general abstract familiarity when in the 1950s he argued for work that was characterized by an interest in the particular, the personal, and the curious. Or in other words, you might say that a productive thesis is going to be specific, it's going to be identifiably yours, and it's going to be a little bit weird. And so if we look at this, I mean, this is very much against the kind of what happens to cliches, right? Cliches eradicate authorship. They follow a kind of familiar formula. These are almost the exact opposite of what cliches do. Now, I wanted to also look at the thesis statements. And there are some tendencies that I think we want to think about a little bit, some cliches in presentations that we tend to rehearse. One, how many of you have presented your project as I'm interested in? My thesis is about, right? Now, just grammatically, there are unfortunate things about this. This kind of construction, nothing happens. I'm interested in, that you're interested at the beginning, you do the thesis, you remain hopefully interested at the end. But nothing really happens, nothing's promised, nothing's lost, nothing's gained. Similarly, my thesis is about, okay, it's about that. And so the standard way to overcome that kind of almost, that problematically insular method of presenting is we often find ourselves saying things like, my thesis challenges something, right? In the language of critical culture, my thesis challenges the idea of facades. Which, if you think about that for a minute, like, what did the idea of facades ever do to you or anyone? Nothing, right? And so this is what I mean, that the kind of language of criticality has itself, in a way, become a cliche, has become a nuisance. So I would also, as much as possible, like to get rid of those. And I'm interested in offering you an alternative, and one that I've found has been working pretty well is to use this instead. I'll bet I can cook up a way to reimagine the 5 points in order to produce something. So if you think about wagers in general, there's always something at stake. Something's going to happen. You're going to win, you're going to lose, you're going to draw. You're all going to draw, I hope. To just re-describe the thesis in terms of a wager, I think automatically forces you to be more specific than I think you would be if you were just describing your interests. I think it automatically puts the stakes on the table. It's very hard to describe a bet without saying what's at stake. It's also very hard to describe a bet without saying what you might win or lose. And the great thing about the thesis is that if you structure it as a bet, it's not just that you win whatever you might win, but that the spoils get distributed to the discipline, so that a productive thesis is going to be a winning bet. The spoils, then we all get to take advantage of. So I would encourage, I've been talking to a lot of you individually about this idea of the wager as a model for presentation. I'd really like you guys to play around with that and see if it works. And all of this, again, I mean, comes out of some things that I've been borrowing from the philosopher Richard Rorty, and I think this is really crucial when he says a talent for speaking differently rather than arguing well is the chief instrument of cultural change, right? And if SCI-Arc thesis has to do with fomenting changes in the culture of architecture, in the discipline of architecture, we see that like, skillful argumentation doesn't always change things very much. It makes people tired, it makes people angry, but it tends not to change very much. The really good arguers tend to remain in positions of power. The weaker arguers tend to remain wherever they are in terms of the power structure. But every once in a while, people just start talking in a different way. Rather than saying, my project challenges blah, 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 like, I'll bet I can do something really different. And that kind of destabilization is something I've become increasingly interested. Some of you have maybe seen this chart that I've been trying to kind of articulate an alternative to that sort of bellicose critical language that I think has become a nuisance, not just for me, but has become a hindrance for a lot of us as we make projects. Now, I want to make sure it's clear. I'm not advocating yet another repetition of the anti-critical project. Critical theory is incredibly good at a lot of stuff. It's also got some blind spots, and I think we have been insufficiently attentive to the blind spots. And so if we look at the words themselves, we can start to find out some interesting things. So critical, critique, its roots are in the Greek word krinein, which has to do with division and judgment, sort of breaking things up into pieces. Theory, of course, has to do with distant overview. That theory is related to the word theater, so it has to do with kind of watching. Theory, if you go deeper into the etymology, theros, I believe is the term, is closely associated with marvels. So the idea that theory has to do with the false is built right into the word as well. So when you hear people saying, I want facts, not theory, or it's only a theory, that's a legitimate use of the word that already has those kind of resonances in there, which we could maybe kind of amplify and do some interesting things with. But in any event, critical theory tends to operate in this mode. It tends to ask questions like, what is this and what does it mean? It tends to operate through logical analysis. We break the thing apart, we chop it into pieces, we figure out what the pieces are. Another way to say that is that the critical theory's technique is generally divide and conquer. And its character is distant and relevant. You don't do theory on the battlefield, right? Theory you do after the fact. And as designers, even though those are incredibly useful, important things that the field needs to keep doing, but design does things before the fact. Like, we need techniques that operate before the thing has happened. And critical theory is not particularly good at that. If you read Michael Hayes's The Introduction to the Big Orange Book, he says exactly that in the introduction. He's like, this is kind of hard to really impact the actual form making with critical theory. Mark Gage, I think, does a really great job in his recent anthology articulating a similar point. And so what I've been trying to cook up is a way to kind of change the way we talk. Not to overthrow critical theory, but rather augment this vocabulary with which we're all pretty good. You know, we're all pretty good at throwing this around. Try to come up with just a different way of talking. So if we think about narrative discourse, narrative, of course, having to do with stories, but also in its etymology having to do with knowledge or skill. And discourse is a really interesting word. When it first entered English, it meant to run over a region. The root word currere comes from the Latin. It has to do not just with talking, but with currency, with current. So it has to do with currency like being timely, with money, with being, with flowing and movement. So all, I think, useful and good associations. The kinds of questions that I think we should be asking have less to do with what it means or what it is, these kind of big, heavy ontological questions or representational, symbolic questions, but rather more immediate questions like what does it do or how does it work? And I think the way to get at that has to do with detailed description. So rather than ripping the thing apart and figuring out what its associations are, what Graham Harman might call undermining or overmining, rather attending specifically to the object itself, what it is, what are its pieces, how do they interact, not trying to connect it to other things, but really figure out how it works. The hope is that would help us to be more timely and current and able to kind of get at the thing we're working on, and would focus us more at action and making as opposed to classification and judgment. So I've been working on this for a while. I hope I can enlist some co-conspirators in developing some of these ideas. But I don't think the chart gets too far into how we might do this kind of stuff. And for that, I will just offer two, not options, because I don't want to think like this is what you should do from now on, but two things that in my own work, both the design work that I used to do and the writing work that I do now, have been, I think, really useful. They also kind of come from Colin Rowe, from the same essay. Character and composition. And I think that thinking about these two qualities, which have been kind of banished in many ways by critical vocabularies, could be interesting. And so I just want to run through a little bit of that. You've seen all this before, so I'm going to go very quickly. But the idea of, that architecture works from a kind of, or form works from a very simple vocabulary, but that it is not neutral, right? As Doug Graff points out in this not famous but should be famous essay, that they're not neutral at all, that points and volumes always make arguments for centers, perimeters, lines and planes always seem to make arguments for separation, that there's always a kind of argument being made by form. No form is neutral, just like no form is apolitical. There's always a kind of argument being made. And also, very importantly, in that same essay from 1986, this notion that all forms are fundamentally unstable, that every perimeter speaks of its absent center. Every center speaks of its vaguely defined perimeter. And so there's always a kind of reciprocity between edges and centers that really has to do with that. That every perimeter, or every square perimeter, at a certain point you stare at it long enough, its modules are going to become apparent. As soon as you got modules, you have kind of axes. And so every form is always going to be, even the simplest, dumbest things are always going to be pregnant with their alternatives, always going to be kind of, like really, like little kids, like they can't sit still. They refuse to just be one thing. So the question, what it is always undermined by form, because form is like, well, it's a square, except a square makes arguments for its corners, which make arguments for centers, which define modules, et cetera. And so any configuration is going to sort of get on this kind of roller coaster of interpretations. We know some of the more familiar ones, that any door is simultaneously a procession and a barrier. We know this kind of famous Egyptian temple is simultaneously one thing and two. And so even kind of old, seemingly, exhausted stuff maintains this kind of strange ambiguity that it won't quite conform to categorical assignments. Like, is it one, is it two? Kind of hard to say. Is it a barrier or is it access? Could be either. And so we want to be facile with that kind of, that ability to kind of describe all the potentialities that live in the form. We're very familiar with this kind of thing. We know, Peter Eisenman's aggressive analyses of formal configurations in something like the famous Maison Domino essay. But I think it's easy to forget that what Peter has done here is told you a story. So not only is he analyzing this form, not only has he switched from perspective to axonometric, not only is he making a serious meditation on the kind of ontology of architectural form, he is. All of that stuff is absolutely part of this conversation. But he's also telling you a story. Once upon a time, there were some planes. They got together in a particular way. They started to kind of tell stories about themselves. It has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end. And whether you look at it, the internal story here, the story of Peter versus Corbusier, the story of Colin Rowe and his own kind of misbehaving progeny, there are narratives that live in this project. There are other narratives. Here's one from Doug, a kind of bizarre one, where if you take the Villa Savoie, turn it upside down and inside out, you pass through the Stoa of Attalus and get the Palazzo Farnese. Which it's easy to look at that and say, well, that's just like silly. And in a way it is, but in a way, this is what we do when we look at buildings. That could be something else. If I just bend it a little bit, like every time you sit down at your screen and start working on a project, what you're doing is a version of this kind of story. It's this now, it could be that if I do some stuff to it. This is also, if this seems a little weird, if we look a little more closely, this is exactly what Kipnis did to Andrew's Mocape project in the figure ground game exhibition last year. He simply took the Mocape project, unfolded it, turned it into some little guys that kind of run around the place. And so, here again we have a kind of funny story. Once upon a time there was a building. It desperately wanted to be a real building, but he didn't win the competition. But by some stroke of magic, it came to life at the Venice Biennale, And then it kind of woke up at SCI-Arc in the Figure Ground Game exhibition, and now it's kind of walking around LA or wherever the thing is now. So the projects don't, I think, necessarily have to be articulated in this really aggressively serious language. That the possibilities of fairy tales are actually quite potent. So here's those guys, the kind of rebirth of the Mocape Museum, which itself is the rebirth, in a funny way, of an old Ben Nicholson project I just learned from Andrew. So sorry to out you. It's also, I think, very important to see, if we go back to Jeff's figure ground model from the Biennale, how careful he is to articulate the vocabulary. Like, these are the pieces that I'm working with. This is kind of what they do, how they work. That there's a really, this kind of generation of the vocabulary of the project, I think, is crucial. I think at this stage in thesis prep, everybody should be working on a kind of cast of characters. Like, what are the pieces that are at play in this scheme? This is what Tom does. There's a cast of characters, there's a cast of operations. So we could see the characters from Le Corbusier were the 4 compositions, the operations or the tectonic aspirations were the 5 points. Here we have something a little looser, but nonetheless doing very similar things, coming up with ways to structure a narrative that can get you from the beginning to the end of the project. And I think this stuff is absolutely crucial, and I don't think you can get that without them. I similarly don't think you can get this without its creation myth. Once upon a time, there was a thing, it got weird through a series of very specific steps that has to do with a mongoose and some other stuff. Maybe you know the story, maybe you don't. But the narrative is just that. It's a story. And it's not that the projects, I'm not trying to say that these projects are just stories and nothing else, but that the story function of these projects is really crucial. So composition really becomes a way to tell those stories. To move on to character, we all know this project. We all know the kind of associations that Jason has made. Basically go to wood construction, figure out all the things that we try to get wood not to do. Warp, crook, bend, all that whole catalog of things that any woodworker will tell you, avoid this at all costs. And Jason simply tells the story that says, well, in the world that this project comes out of, all of those bad things are now good. That warped wood is now a new virtue. So we know that story. We also know the story that this is very interested in the idea of posture, right? That how does the building, what is its attitude? How is its attitude conveyed by form? And we know that Jason was studying cows, but it's important to remember that he wasn't just studying cows, he was studying very particular disciplinary cows from William Gilpin's treatise on the picturesque. So there is a very specific kind of cow that is generated here. Kipnis, I think, similarly was studying certain kind of formal attitudes, which is it. I don't think he had ever seen that guy, but clearly there's a connection. And now, so obviously a lot of people are working on posture. I think a lot of you are probably going to aim toward posture. I think it's still a kind of hot topic. What I want to encourage you to do is avoid the idea that your thesis has to do with posturism or posturicity or the posturification of form. Not because those are like somebody will have, if posture really takes off as a thing, somebody will write that book, it'll be on Sucker Punch. But your job right now is to develop specific kinds of posture. Here's cow posture, here's drunk posture. This has to do less with establishing a new paradigm than it does with establishing articulating a set of interests that are more aimed at a smaller group, not aimed at the entire world. So point number 4 has to do with developing new vocabularies, and it dovetails right into the last part, which has to do with the political agenda that we've been discussing in thesis this semester. And it has to do with the idea of enfranchisement. So here again is Jeff's White Walker, and here's something that he said in an interview not long after it came out. So he says, I have a certain prejudice against rectitude. I'm tired of every building telling me I should be young and fit and have good posture. I'm not young, I'm not fit, I like to sit hunch over. I'm often drunk and I like to lean on stuff. So just once, I'd like to walk into a city and have a few buildings tell me you're okay, you're part of it, the world, and you belong to the world, right? And I think that this is the kind of political work that we can be doing. I don't think we can be changing policy with architecture. I don't think we're going to solve the Middle East crisis or the oil crisis or environmental crisis, although architecture could maybe contribute to those things. But I think architecture has much more potency in sort of enfranchising smaller groups that maybe haven't been reinforced by the field before. I think this is not a new idea either. If we look at Dave Hickey and his writings about Robert Mapplethorpe, when Mapplethorpe was under serious attack from the conservative establishment in the 1980s, where Hickey says, "The task of beauty is to enfranchise an audience and acknowledge its power, to designate a territory of shared values between the image and its beholder, and then in this territory to advance an argument by valorizing the picture's problematic content." I think these two are doing very similar things, and I think these two critics are saying very similar things. And it has to do not with attacking something that's bad or oppressive, not with standing up and saying, fight the power, or smash the idols, or attack the man, but rather simply saying that there is a kind of, there are positive qualities about being a slob, which can be articulated. There are positive qualities about not being like every other person, about not being straight, for instance, that can be articulated as a celebration rather than an attack. So when you look at Mapplethorpe's work, his appropriation of the classical tradition is like the opposite of a critical attack on the established. Like, we don't need the establishment. Look how hot we are. You know, and so I think that architecture can kind of do that. And I think in a funny way, this is doing just that. You know, in some sense, it's providing an alternative, that architecture does seem conventionally in a position that foregrounds standing up straight, and so being a little bit crooked is somehow articulated here. It's kind of like this. In Koolhaas's own kind of squiggling and the squiggling of skyscrapers, but also constructing an incredibly detailed narrative about skyscrapers cheating on each other and getting caught, and we know the Statue of Liberty comes to life and all this stuff. But so formally, I think Jeff's project looks like this, but I think it actually acts much more like this. And I think this is where we could devote a little bit more attention in the thesis projects these days. It's like, what are really the constraints and possibilities associated with our project, and how can we negotiate the hierarchies, the value systems of those constraints? So Schumi looks at the constraints of conventional construction and sees them as a new kind of pleasure. And so I think, and in so doing, this is clearly not for everybody, but there is a kind of possibility in architecture to see things that were formerly bad as a new kind of good. And I think that has to do with this idea of enfranchising new constituencies. That each project, if it has a political dimension, I think it has to have an attitude about who its constituency is, how it addresses that constituency. So, just really quickly to review, here are the 5 points. I think they will work. I would be happy if some of you experimented with them as a possibility, and that's it. Thanks for listening.